What does a face like flint look like? That's the description of the servant that Isaiah describes in that first reading that we heard this morning. The prophet is speaking to a people who in Babylon who are in exile, and promises a time when God will put an end to their suffering and humiliation. We hear that servant say today, I have set my face like flint, knowing that I shall not be put to shame. I have seen that flinty face in athletes. It is the determined and set features of the marathon runner crossing over the finish line. It's a pitcher's expression as he hurls that baseball down the pike into the catcher's mitt. A 14-year-old gymnast shows her flinty face as she stares up at the high bar before she launches into her medal-contending program. Isaiah tells us that this is the expression on the face of the prophet that God has chosen for a very difficult mission. The servant's charge is to speak to his people in slavery who are weary of hearing promises that never seem to materialize. They are burnt out in their exile. They are even hesitant to put their trust in the good news that the prophet has for them. And the servant's message is not received. He is not only suffering physical pain here, but also ridicule as well. But although the servant has been humiliated in God's service, he trusts that God will vindicate him. While there is nothing but rejection for him, he relies on God for the strength to keep going day after day. He will not give up his mission. Haven't we seen flinty face of God's servants in our own time and place? We have sat by the bedsides of dying family members and friends who were determined in their suffering to set a good example for their grieving children and loved ones, some who might not even share the same faith. We have prayed with them, and by their courageous and faithful example, we have been strengthened ourselves to trust in God, even in those dire circumstances. We saw a face set like flint of Oscar Romero, who continued to preach even after he received death threats. And the life he gave for his people strengthened the resolve both of his co-workers and a whole nation of suffering ones who were exiled in their own land. Do you remember Nelson Mandela's face as he walked out of prison after so many years of doing hard time? His was the face of long suffering and flint. He set that face not to revenge, but to seek justice done for those who had been wronged. And did you ever see a photograph of Dorothy Day, who sat in a little chair at a protest for the poor someplace? A seemingly frail old woman flanked by two beefy police officers. But there she was, with that determined, set jaw and steadfast look. This list is endless. And a flinty face doesn't just mean gritting your teeth to get through a difficult period, bearing the discomfort and pain until it's over. It isn't just bracing oneself and resisting an intolerable or unjust situation. We will see a flinty face in Jesus this whole week as he faces obstinate forces of resistance and evil that will put him to death. We will see through these passion narratives the cost he will pay as he follows through on his words and actions. Like Isaiah's servant, Jesus too has set his face like flint. He has worn this expression for some time now. You know, Matthew says much earlier in this gospel, from that time on, Jesus began to say plainly to his disciples, I must go to Jerusalem and suffer much. That's where we find him in today's gospel. Entering Jerusalem, determined to fulfill his Father's will. God's faithful servant here has set his face like flint. Jesus, like Isaiah, speaks to a people enslaved. But their exile is their own sin, and Jesus reaches out to them, but they would rather stay imprisoned in their own notions of God and holiness and of what's right and wrong. They are prisoners of their own self-righteousness. But despite this hostility that he meets, Jesus stays the course. He remains faithful to his calling to speak the weary word to those who will rouse from them. And as we watch events unfold this week, we bring our less than flinty faces. We bring our less than committed selves. We have not always been willing to stand up for what we believe. We sometimes preferred to be accepted by those around us. We confess that we have been weak when we needed to be strong, pliable when we should have stood firm, tepid when the gospel called us to a commitment and sacrifice. We would rather not hear all Jesus says about denying self and taking up the cross. Because Jesus did turn his face like flint to do what is needed to be done for us, we find relief this Holy Week. These special days offer us a chance to hear afresh our calling to join Jesus on his path to a new life. As these days come to a close, and we hear again the good news of his resurrection, we will be filled with hope. And together with Bill and Roberta and Seth, Nadine and Michael, we will all renew our baptismal promises at the vigil service. Because of Jesus' flint, we live faithful lives of service. We can continue to minister even after the initial glow is gone. We are not dissuaded even when the institutional church lets us down. And we are willing to face new challenges even though we have faced the same ones so many times before. A well-trained tongue is given to us this week to speak to the weary, those weary from constant family strife, those weary from poverty, homelessness, low-paying jobs, violence, war, fear, or an ongoing illness or slow dying of a loved one. We can also speak on behalf of the weary in settings where they might not be listened to or where their weariness is ignored. Jesus enters the holy city this week. The people who welcomed him wanted to see his glory. They're going to be disappointed. because it comes to them in a way that they can't recognize. It comes in obedience and service to God. But while they don't see his glory, we do. Our God has chosen to take on our pain by becoming human. Our God has chosen to walk our path. And because Jesus was willing to enter into his suffering, that means that every place in which innocence suffers, that's holy ground. This week reminds us that we discover holy ground whenever and wherever we are willing to become personally engaged in the pain and struggle of others. By our presence at all of the liturgies this week, we will enter into a special union with Christ.